Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. It's the only thing that ever has." That statement epitomizes bare-knuckle democracy. It's underway right now in 21 communities in British Columbia. Communities that are fed up and they're not going to take it anymore. They've come together to petition the provincial government to change regulations that favor resource developers over local citizens, local governments, and the environment. The BC Coalition for Forestry Reform says it's time to put an end to a Campbell government regulation that handed land use oversight back to the companies that are logging and mining on Crown lands. The regulation is called professional reliance or self-regulation. Since its introduction more than 15 years ago, the Coalition says watersheds have come under attack and there's nothing local governments can do to stop it. The Coalition contends professional reliance puts logging companies in a conflict of interest. They say, how can a company be entrusted to protect the very environment it utilizes to make money? When that happens, the environment is a regular loser. We invited Taryn Skalbania of the Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance to join us for a conversation that matters about the right to roll up your sleeves and make sure your government represents everyone's interests.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
We find ourselves in an interesting situation right now. The provincial government has asked for a response to this professional reliance legislation that exists. Let's talk about what that is and then where you think we need to go. So what is professional reliance?
It's known by its opponents as the fox running the henhouse.
The fox running the henhouse, yeah.
Yes, and being a farmer, I know all that, what that means. But it's the industries in BC being regulated by the people who work for the industry. Mm-hmm. So, for example, logging, the foresters making the rules and being responsible for monitoring the logging industry.
Okay, so on the outside when you say that, I go, okay, so I would want foresters making those rules. But it's a little bit more than that, isn't it? It's the foresters who are working for the forest company.
Yes, they're being paid to do work that may or may not benefit the rest of the environment or the communities that they're working in. They're being paid to get the best price of wood and to get the best amount of wood out for the cheapest.
You're being very cautious about saying it is a conflict of interest.
It's
That's the way you see it as a conflict of interest.
Yes, I do. A lot of people do. I do too. Yes.
And so why? Like, why does that become a conflict of interest? We need, let's say, professionals in particular industries to be on top of this. They have to have a commitment to the industry. What is it about the current situation that causes you so much concern, and where's the evidence to back it up?
I don't think that all professionals in our industry are like this. Say, for example, a doctor or an engineer. You know, they're more precautionary. It's a doctor's job to keep people alive or keep airplanes in the air. So they take a more cautionary, approach. Whereas in the forestry industry, it's less precautions are taken. It's more about dollars, the bottom line. So gambles are taken, and it eventually will catch up in our environment.
Well, you say you've seen it happen where you call home, Peachland. Tell me what's going on there, and why does it start to cause you concern that, okay, they're carrying out their duties for a forest company, okay, so what? But where does it start to cross the line and have an impact on the community?
We have a water treatment system, and legally the District of Peachland has to supply water to its 5,000 inhabitants. Mm-hmm. However, they have no say in what happens in the watershed.
How's that possible?
Well, it's Crown land, and the government has given 100% of control to the logging companies. The foresters and licensees have more control in a community watershed than the community. They can tell you where they're logging, when they're logging, what they're logging, how they're logging, and we have no say. They advise us, but the District of Peachland or a regional district or any jurisdiction has no say in what happens to the logging. in the
So
area.
I thought the Forest Practices Code that was brought in by the Mark Harcourt government going back to the 1990s would have addressed all of these kinds of issues, because when you took a look at the stack of recommendations or regulations that came with all of that, I was under the impression that all of these things had been addressed because they were so concerned about preserving habitat, and not just for fish, but everywhere. What happened?
Well, in the 2000, that great document, the Forestry Practices Code, was thrown out. It did have its problems too, but in the interest of saving money and reducing the amount of labor as far as forest rangers and foresters in the government, they adopted something called the Forestry and Range Practices Act, which gave the power to the professionals in the logging industry.
So they actually took the power out of the hands of the regulators and gave it to the users.
Exactly. There's no more Ministry of Forests. It became Ministry of Forests, Lands, and Natural Resources, and they also added, agricultural land use in there. And there's actually a little passage in the Forestry Range Practices Act that people who are opposing things like logging have no say if it unduly reduces the amount of timber supply. So we can say all we want. If they can ruin our water system, we can say please don't. But if it ruins their timber supply or reduces their timber supply, we have no say.
Got to get you to hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Sorry for the interruption, but I need your help. I'm asking you to support the show by becoming a patron. That means pledging $1 per show. Conversations is a unique program. There's no grandstanding, no arguing, no yelling. Instead, I sit down with people who have unique insights, specialized knowledge, and experiences that inform and enlighten. And we do this on an incredibly limited budget with a very small crew. Well, this is my office, and it's where I edit the show. And then once it's ready, we give it away. So many different websites around the world are carrying this show, but they get it for free. They don't pay us. So I'm asking you to pledge $1 per show by going to patreon.com/conversations that matter. Thanks. We want to keep producing conversations, and with your help, we can. Now let's get back to the show. Were you paying attention to this as it happened?
No, not at first, no. And we're there's 488 community watersheds in British Columbia. So everybody lives in a watershed or an air shed or a soil shed. However, there's more and more, it's ongoing communities having issues with their water system. More and more communities having to build expensive water treatment plants because the effects of logging in their watersheds.
So what's happening? You say they're building, roads and they're logging. So what's been the impact on community watersheds?
Well, anytime you deforest, whether naturally or
through forest fire.
For forest fire, bug kill, landslides happen naturally. Those are enough threats. But you bring in logging, clear cuts, and road building. It's the road building especially that impacts watersheds, because all runoff is channeled into ditches and culverts, and that it really accelerates.
And then it continues on downhill.
Yeah. And we had a ditch in Peachland. It wasn't there last year, but this year it was 2 kilometers long, and you could drive your Jeep through it.
Through the ditch? Through
the ditch on the side of a road, yeah. And where that water came from, we don't know. Where all that soil went, well, it's eventually now in Lake Okanagan, but amazing amount of power behind runoff. When you speak to industry professionals, they'll tell you, well, it was Mother Nature, it was an extreme weather year, weather-related event. But when you speak to other critics, they said it has a lot to do with the accelerated pace of clear-cut logging in the Okanagan, especially in steep, critical watersheds. Like our terrain is really steep already, so we already get natural mudslides. And yes, they have rules in this Forestry Range Practices Act of how much clear cutting can be allowed in certain areas, certain elevations. But again, the professionals are monitoring it are the ones that would benefit from having these clear cut areas. So there's
or benefit from not impeding the total amount of wood that's being output.
And you know, they all go to university and they're all foresters, but they're taught in this university of a sustainable forestry model.
Yeah.
Which a lot of critics question as well, because we have yet to clear cut, harvest, replant, and clear cut again. That whole model hasn't happened yet. They've only been clear cutting in the 70s. They've just started reforestation. So these trees that are at the most are 50 years old, at the most, are at 5 to 6 inches to a foot a year of growth. So at the most, they're 50 feet tall. Let's say, for example, in the Okanagan. They grow much slower. In the coast or Vancouver Island, it's a different scenario. So they should have different rules everywhere. So these trees are now, say, 50 feet tall. They should be logged when they're 80 to 100, 120 feet. That's what a good pine tree is. That's what they're looking for. But with other variables like climate change and this extreme weather, who knows if they're going to be getting these trees that are ready to be harvested again. So to call the logging industry sustainable is a guess. You know, I'm a farmer. I know if I plant something and harvest it and replant, it'll take me a whole season of grow to know if that's sustainable, what I'm doing. And they haven't had that yet. They don't know if it's sustainable. There's no scientific data to back this up. And we've got some data from places like Norway, Iceland. They were clear cut, I think 1,200 years ago, Iceland was denuded. Norway has clear cut, harvested, replanted, and they're on to their second cycle now, and they're not getting great results with the regrow. Of course, it's a different climate and different areas and different ways of forestry. Maybe they're better with their clear cutting, maybe they're worse. It's not all equal, but I would say it would be gambling to say that this forestry is sustainable. And I'm not a forestry expert at all. That's the problem with, we're just community groups, and you know, we've had to learn how to take soil samples. We've learned to test the water for turbidity. We're out there, you know, checking on species at risk, counting moose droppings, planting grass seeds, looking for Lewis's woodpeckers. So what's happened now, because the government has given up monitoring the forests, they've outsourced that to professionals. Well, the professionals aren't doing the job that we think they should be doing, so now they've outsourced it to us. We've had to go...
Yeah, but not intentionally, unintentionally.
No, unintentionally.
What happened that made you go, hang on a second, you know, there's a problem here. We need to find out what's going on. What was that thing that motivated you to get involved?
Well, for me personally, it was a large mudslide that came into our water reservoir area about 50 meters from the intake. And
when was that?
It was in May of 2017. So during a high freshet or spring runoffs.
Yeah.
Turbidity is normal in any creek source water system.
Right.
You know, if you don't draw from a well or from deep under the lake, you get spring runoff and you get the tannins in the water will color the water. And some people just drink it, but if you're pregnant or have a compromised immune system or a senior, they advise you not to. So we started with the boil water notice. And that happens yearly in Peachland. We talk to pioneers, and we've got anecdotal evidence that since the turn of the century, there was always 1 or 2 weeks a year there was a boil water notice. Well, our boil water notice lasted 5 months this year.
5 months?
So there's more stuff coming into our water system.
Yeah.
And it did. It shut down our water treatment plant for a while. So it's cost us a huge amount in extra chlorine. So now we're ingesting more chlorine, which, you know, of course, the government tells you it's fine, like fluoride. We're now paying for more filters because our water treatment plant's getting plugged. And we had to actually remove boulders, rocks, and sludge from both our water intakes. That was a cost of about $260,000 to $350,000. Those final costs aren't even in yet. There's also another factor that's really affecting our little town of Peachland. We want them to help preserve our watershed and protect it, because anything you do up in the watershed translates as being a lot cheaper, safer, easier to do than treating the water at the tap. So our government in Peachland, unfortunately, has decided to go just with water treatment plant measures. So they've just approved a $10 million loan. There are 5,000 residents are going to have to pay back for a $24 million water treatment plant. Our current water treatment plant is just filtration. So now with this new plant, state-of-the-art, will have UV sensitivity, filtration, and chlorination. So it should get rid of all that turbidity. as long as there isn't a major mudslide, deforestation from forest fire, logging. There's no guarantees.
Okay, so this is what made you say, well, hang on a second. Why are we having to go out and spend $24 million on a new water treatment plant? Like, why does this situation exist? Was it a real eye-opener for you when you started to see what the regulations were?
It was. I was absolutely shocked. I did not know that the District of Peachland had no say on what was happening in their own watershed. It's 400 square kilometers, yet, and full of pressures. They have no say over the 1,500 head of cattle that range there 5 months of the year and poop 100 pounds of manure a day into our creeks and streams.
Oh my God.
Unfenced, unmonitored. By rangers and ranchers are professionals, but no one monitors that.
Well, there's an awful lot of waterborne illnesses that can be associated with that.
You know, let the beaver and deer be there, but now we have cattle ranging. Again, I'm a farmer, I have cattle, so I would still take 1,500 head of cattle over a clear cut, but we also have recreational use. We have old Brenda Mines legacy. We have you know, there's 3 kilometers of road in our watershed per every square kilometer. That's a huge, mass amount of crisscrosses through our forests.
Those are not paved roads. Those are
they're not paved roads. They're gravel roads. And you know, rain on a gravel road might as well be rain on a parking lot. It just, you know, you don't understand it until you go into perspective, like a place like Vancouver. You're not allowed to walk in the watersheds. Never mind logging, cattle ranging, ATV tours. There's a guy prospecting for copper right now in Peachland. He's allowed to disturb Beaver Dam because he's got some rights to
I know, because when I think about the water reserves here, they're all fenced off and you are not allowed in there for any reason whatsoever. Victoria's
is slightly different. You're allowed to mountain bike in Victoria's reserve. So that's one of the issues that our groups found out about, these watershed reserves. Vancouver bought their watershed area.
So they own it.
Leased it, 999 years. They allowed some logging in the 70s, and then they realized that the value of timber can nowhere come close to the value of clean drinking water for a population.
Right.
And Victoria's different. They actually use legislation to protect their watershed.
So you have this mudslide. It motivates you to get involved. It's an eye-opener. We've got a new government that's come in, though, that seems to be listening. Is this encouraging for you, or do you remain concerned?
We remain concerned. Right after we galvanized after the first mudslide, there was a second mudslide. Took out our other water treatment system, not much more than a month later. And we actually called a state of emergency in Peachland.
In Peachland?
In Peachland had their very first historical state of emergency because this mudslide was so close to taking out the water treatment plant. It started by this legacy mine, Brenda Mines. You know, we then had another smaller bunch of mudslides and runoff, and then the whole water situation was overshadowed, though, with the Okanagan Lake flooding. I mean, we had this historical rise of lake water, 7 feet above normal. It's amazing. And everybody was busy bailing out their basements. They didn't really care what was coming out of their taps. So that kind of got quieted down. And however, we were optimistic because every municipality around Lake Okanagan and every regional district banded together, and they approached the government at the time, which was still the Liberals, and asked for a complete review of what caused the flooding.
And the response?
The study's still not out, but upland logging is one of the factors they're going to look into. You know,
upland logging.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means logging above in the watershed.
Oh.
There's they call it a gentleman's agreement in the Okanagan that forestry companies don't log anything with visual impact.
Because they don't want to affect tourism.
Don't want to affect tourism and the property values and other things. But there's no trees left in BC. That's what the word is on the street. There's about 10 years, 20 at the most, even the ministry is saying that. And then the foresters are going to be quite quiet. There'll be a little bit of a lull until these trees that they've planted start to catch up. They said, so that's why they've come down into critical watersheds or logging in communities.
Why do you want to have this conversation? Why do you want to make it public at this point? What do you want people to do with this information?
Well, it's amazing how I noticed there was a mudslide, and the very next week, one of the licensees, which is a forestry company, we have 4 in Peachland logging, pressure on our watershed, approached the mayor and council saying our forestry stewardship plan has expired. We're writing a new one. We will be relogging in 5 years throughout your watershed. And they just tell them that as a privilege, courtesy.
Yeah.
And District Peachland can't do anything, and they go ahead. The only thing the District Peachland can do is restrict the amount of trucks going down through their roads. But the mills are employers, and you don't really want to
have an
create
impact on jobs. Right.
too much of a kerfuffle.
Yeah.
So, I immediately went to council and I wrote letters to the editor, and how dare you support logging? And then I find out
They had no choice.
They had no choice. My family and other groups that I belong to had been worried about the logging in the on our watershed for a while, because we're all outdoors people. I do backcountry horse riding, and we do cross-country skiing. My husband's a biker and fisherman, and so we've noticed that every year we have to go less far because the further places we went, our ski trails have all now been clear-cut. And we even asked the logging companies, can we maintain those trails? They're designated trails. These are trails that are built by federal grant money as make work projects. And they said, no, unless you've actually got designation recreation. They said we couldn't possibly keep every trail that people use in British Columbia. It'd be too expensive. So we started to band together with a bunch of other groups, and about 40 of us started to get together in my living room, and we created this Peachland Watershed Protection Alliance. We're our vision would be a universal understanding of the value of water. Water is more important than other values in our watershed.
Right, and so then you learned that you're not alone. There are other groups like this around the province as well.
Yeah, our very first town hall meeting, I invited the whole world, and we talked to mayor and council. A fellow showed up from Apex, and he'd been challenged the same way. Apex, not so much as a watershed issue, but a visual impact. All the property owners in Apex rely on tourism, and they clear-cut all the vistas around Apex. They have 3 different logging companies. It is well known that every tree in British Columbia is of value and loggable, and they've just announced that every watershed, if done properly, is loggable.
So when the provincial government comes along and says, okay, we're going to review this legislation.
We were giddy.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're cautiously giddy. Otherwise, you wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Well, it's outsourcing. Why do I have to tell them what they already know? Since the 70s, there's reviews, there's forestry practice board complaints, there's compliance and enforcement complaints. They've known so they know that there's a problem. They don't need me, a community member, to tell them that there's a problem.
Well, I wish you all the best of luck. Thank you for
you.
coming in and sharing this, what I consider to be a very important conversation.
Good. Thank you very much for the invitation.